Welcome to Cheerful to Stormy, the everyday podcast with Ollie Schmidt. Since September 23rd, the PME Family Service has been running the Show Attitude campaign, which focuses on how we can stay in conversation with each other in difficult situations. This is also today's topic. We see it in the current election results, in social media comments, or in conversations by the office coffee machine. Our society is deeply divided on issues such as war, migration, climate change, gender issues, or vaccination. Polarization doesn't stop at families and friendships. This, of course, also applies to the workplace. Conflicts and differences of opinion can affect the team's morale. Today, I want to discuss with my guest, Derya Bobrik, how we can continue talking even when our opinions on contemporary issues significantly differ. Where are the limits, and where can curiosity and openness bring us back together? Derya Bobrik is a psychologist and systemic coach, working at PME Family Service in Hamburg as a life situations coach. Welcome, Derya.
Hi, Ollie. Nice to be here today.
Yes, thank you for taking the time for the second time to be on our podcast. Loyal listeners will already know Derya, and today we have the honor, or rather I have the honor, of speaking with you again, dear Derya. And I'd like to dive straight into the topic. We have already mentioned that it concerns staying in conversation with each other in difficult situations or when opinions differ greatly. And we all know those moments when we are confronted with statements that rub us the wrong way. Whether it's at the coffee machine, in the break room, or wherever, what can I do when such differences in opinion cause tension or conflict in the team? How can this be resolved professionally?
Yes, right away, a good first question. One problem is that we are often completely caught off guard and don't expect that a statement will come out of nowhere, so we're not prepared for it. And then, everyone listening will surely know this feeling, whether it's in a work context, on the bus, or anywhere else, where you think, oh darn, I missed the right response there, and would have liked to react better, cooler, or differently at that moment. It's certainly valuable that you're listening to this podcast right now, because hopefully, this episode will make it a bit easier for you to react better the next time you're in such a situation.
That is our goal.
Exactly. That means thinking ahead about how I can react well in such a situation. And I would like to provide a bit of tools and ideas for that today. At the same time, I think it's also important to allow oneself to be overwhelmed in such a situation and not to react ideally. That's something very human, and it's okay. Still, maybe one can do a little better each time. Exactly. For that, it's important to first sort out the statements a bit. It can be anything from things where you might raise your eyebrows and think, okay, let it slide. Maybe it's not quite okay to say that, but you can comfortably ignore it, and it doesn't really harm anyone. Up to, let's go to the extreme, there might be statements that are dehumanizing and not compatible with our constitution and understanding of democracy. And depending on where one finds oneself on that spectrum, there are, of course, different ways to react. Before we dive into that, a little headline is important to me to have a good conversation, namely, language as a sign of one's mindset. Okay, I've found that when we listen to other people, we quickly start putting them into boxes. It's something we always do, and it's okay. That is, our pigeonholing, our unconscious biases, are happening automatically in the background all the time to make life a bit easier for us. And this often also happens with language. That is, when I hear you using gender-neutral language, we're suddenly at a really hot topic. Let's see how many listeners right now, at this moment, turn off or are happy. Yes, let's stay with gendering. When I hear that you use gender-inclusive language, maybe I immediately put you in a box and think, Ollie is one of those left-wing Green Party woke types. Maybe that's the box that opens. Or the opposite. If I hear that you don't use gender-inclusive language, then I think, oh, you're kind of stuck, conservative, not up to date, and don't care about women. Maybe you even neglect them. These would be very extreme categories. But what often happens is we immediately try to categorize things. And the problem with that ties back to the professional aspect. It makes communication really difficult. If I put you in such a box and then make judgments because I might perceive you as less competent and can't listen to you as well, because I don't trust you, it makes our whole communication harder. So, when you, as a listener, next enter a situation and know, my colleague thinks I'm in a certain political corner or have a certain moral stance, you can lay it out directly. As they say, address the elephant in the room. You might say something like, Ollie, we can totally talk about that. It's important to me that you know beforehand, I'm generally more left-wing, but it's important to me to be neutral on this topic, to listen to you, and not let this turn into a battle of ideologies. Although I usually have certain values, I really want to listen to you now. And on that level, we can start communicating with each other. Behind this, there's a bit of this perception of humans. You're okay, I'm okay. This phrase originates from transactional analysis and simply assumes, which I find a very nice idea, that we are human. Simple as it sounds, it assumes that we are human, that people have reasons for what they do. Our behavior, our statements are not irrational. This means next time in the office, it's important to know that Ollie and I are direct colleagues and we regularly work together in the office. If you say something that irritates me, it helps if I don't think, oh, Ollie is just like that, and put you in a box and judge you and then stop listening to you. If I think, Ollie, fundamentally, I like you, and I consider you a very capable colleague, and I appreciate your competence and humor, and you're okay. A single statement can be something I find stupid, incorrect, or even condemn, but not you as a whole person. And then it's still possible for us to meet each other at eye level, so I can give feedback, and you don't feel personally attacked, but we're just talking about that one action, and I can still come to you next time if I have a follow-up question, want coaching, or need your expertise.
And if I manage to see it from this perspective, then it's actually very appreciative when I can say, listen up, I like you, I value your expertise, and I enjoy working with you. And what you just said rubbed me the wrong way, and it doesn't fit the picture I usually have of you. That's why it's important for me to point it out to you and tell you, so that A, it doesn't get between us, and B, maybe we can figure out together where that suddenly came from.
Yes, the way you're pronouncing it now, it even creates something like a framework of trust. So with that, we're creating a space to say, okay, we can talk about it. That might be, and I believe this is important to note, not always possible in every setting. It also depends a bit on the team situation, what the collegial relationship is like. But if it's possible, then it's really worth its weight in gold, and indeed fosters secure communication.
And now you've just said the principle, the motto is you're okay, I'm okay. That means sometimes, or rather not just sometimes, it's not about right or wrong, but first about the fact that there are two different opinions that are just different. And it's about looking together at how we can handle it well. And the topic of values is certainly important there too. How important is it for you from your perspective to engage in dialogue about values? And how can one do that in a constructive way?
Yes, I believe that's a really complex question to answer simply and effectively, and at the same time it's very important. I've just mentioned it, and I think we always need to consider the setting. So what is the collegial relationship like? Are these people who only work together and have nothing else to do with each other? Might there be more than just collegial relationships? Could there be friendships? Or is it a situation where people spend private time together and talk about things other than work? And what does the company want? What's behind it? I'm thinking, for example, of our company PME, Familienservice, where certain values are indeed relevant. For example, being open and welcoming towards people is important in order to do good coaching, to approach it without prejudice. And if you found out that I constantly speak about others in a biased way, I'm assuming on your behalf now, it would probably make you uncomfortable knowing I'm going into the next coaching session while constantly judging people. That means values would be important, and it would definitely be important for you to address that it's an issue, maybe between us first, and if it continues to be an issue, perhaps involve others like a supervisor to resolve it, depending on how the team settings are, and make it a topic of discussion. The question that's really behind it is, how can work be done well? In the work context, friendships don't have to happen. It's certain that teams can be friends, but that's not the goal of the workplace. And I think it's sometimes important to look at this very soberly and rationally. Friendships don't need to form there, yet we need an environment where people can work. If I hear something from you every day and that unsettles me, that gives me a stomachache, and I take that home, then it causes me stress, and it makes me a worse worker. It's not about whether we're friends or not, and that's why I bring it up, but rather that maybe I don't feel safe at work. So the underlying question is, how can work well for me? What do I need to work effectively? And then there might be situations where it's sensible to talk things over. Before that, I should ask myself if I see a chance for resolution, or do I assume it only leads to escalation? Or sometimes do I just want to be right? Is it about opening up a discussion to enter into a right and wrong space and saying, these are the right values, and I need to proselytize or convince the other person of my values? So I think these are the questions that are important to then come up with a good answer yourself. I've done this quite cleverly now, Ollie, because I've answered your question with lots of questions, but I want to put it in perspective very briefly, because the questions are important to be able to answer it well yourself. So one has to ask these questions oneself to arrive at a suitable answer.
And sometimes we have questions that need additional questions to reach a good answer. There's the saying, the quality of the question determines the quality of the answer. Yes, sometimes I need yet another question to finally arrive at a good answer, like first figuring out what we're really dealing with here. Exactly, that's what you just did. And I find that in which context we're actually working together is particularly important. So I believe it's actually different whether I work on an assembly line or in a production where the work and its result predominantly focus on material outcomes, or whether I work in a context involving people where I'm advising people, working with people, or in frequent contact with people, then this topic naturally has a different relevance. And as a colleague, it might also be more important to me what my colleagues think and their attitudes to have the trust that I can work well with them.
Yes, right now, I'm thinking to myself about the image that came from an advertising agency, for instance, where you sometimes might want to sell or communicate values or even generate them, which is perhaps more relevant there. And I believe it's also possible in those spaces to create a setting or an environment where political topics can't take place, where you can distance yourself from them and maybe create a safe space for yourself if you realize it's too much. Later, I brought some phrases that might make it easier to set boundaries. But it's really important to listen to your own feelings and see what you need to do your job well and what you can do to achieve that. And an answer could sometimes be to see how much you're in evaluation or interpretation mode as opposed to observing. So it's actually a kind of magic tool to better handle such situations if you manage to observe instead of interpreting and evaluating. Because we often end up in this uncomfortable, arrogant position where you mentioned earlier this right or wrong dynamic arises and it becomes challenging to interact professionally.
I would like to step away from the work context a bit, although not entirely from it, but I would like to address a specific topic. We all know the phrase, "You can't say anything anymore these days." Particularly in the context of comedy, this comes up occasionally, where somewhere in comedy statements are made or jokes are told that then elicit strong reactions or feedback. So, how is it now? Can you really not say anything anymore? And is humor allowed to cover everything?
Oh yes, interesting. The phrase humor is allowed anything is one that everyone has probably heard before. I find it interesting what assumptions and theses are interwoven in that question. Speaking personally, I believe humor is allowed almost anything. But even here, I think it's important to stay within legal limits and avoid degrading or inflammatory content, as I believe such things have no place in humor. Apart from that, humor can do anything. What's behind this idea is essentially the topic of freedom of expression. I think it's just important to view it from both sides. That means humor is allowed to do anything, but I'm allowed to find it dumb and to say that I can't relate to it. I might not find it funny, which may not say that I lack a sense of humor, but perhaps it was just a bad joke. For me, the more intriguing question, and I like to engage with the topic of humor and comedy, is what is the intent of comedy? When I take the stage, for example, or when I don't and just make a joke in a break room, what am I hoping to achieve? If I receive feedback from someone that says, "You hurt me with that," or that someone feels uncomfortable because they know someone who struggles with that particular issue daily and they don't find it funny when I joke about it, then it's interesting to just stand there and say, well, humor is allowed anything. For me, humor is something to create fun and joy. If it generates the opposite, then you've perhaps missed the point of the topic entirely. So rather the question should be, what does humor want to achieve? And there's also this unwritten rule that comedians like to have, which is to punch up. So why should I make fun of a group of people who are already disadvantaged by life, who already have it tough? And maybe that's also the perspective. The people who are listening to this podcast might not know this about you, Ollie, depending on the person. But besides all your other qualities, you're also in a wheelchair.
Exactly.
And that means maybe you have a different perspective as well. I'm here as an expert, but you might, as someone affected, have a very personal opinion, which I find really intriguing. What's your perspective on, for example, jokes about people with disabilities? How do you feel about that?
Of course, I have dealt with it a lot because jokes that are made on stage sometimes go off the rails and then people talk about it. Or in everyday life, I hear jokes that I think, oh, that was borderline. For me, there are two things. On one hand, as a disabled person, I can make any joke about my disability that I find funny. Yeah, but you can't do that. You can do that with me, especially when I feel when the relationship between us is good. There is this saying, the way we relate determines what we can discuss. That means how we relate determines the topics we can talk about. And because we know each other well, because we've been working together for a long time and understand each other very well, you can even make a somewhat harsher joke. If someone on the street were to throw such a joke in my face, I would say, no, that's not okay. And then I expect people to listen to those affected and say, okay, I consider your perspective, and if it hurt you, I'm sorry because that wasn't my intention. I assume people don't intentionally want to hurt others, and in that case, I must retract it. And if people tell me they want to be addressed a certain way, then I do that, even if I find it strange. I saw an Instagram live with Raoul Krauthausen the other day.
Great.
A disabled activist who has brittle bone disease, is very active on social media and also on television, and he spoke with a black woman. The discussion was exactly about the topic of how one is allowed to refer to people who are black. And that's why I'm saying this now, because this woman said, black, yes, it is not colored, it is not dark-skinned, it's not anything else, but we are black people, period. This is something that can continue to change over the course of discussion, time, and societal engagement. Yes, but it's about listening to those affected, and I find that very, very important. When you're in dialogue with them, when you talk to them, and when you get feedback on how they see it, then it's okay.
So maybe a little bit about what my connection is to the group of people I'm speaking about. Exactly, yes, that's me. It's also about the perspective, and this is initially a personal opinion, but what is my intention behind saying that? And it can also be nice to give people a platform, especially for groups that are often discriminated against in life. I can't think of many comedians in wheelchairs off the top of my head. When I think about it, I actually find it nice when someone in a wheelchair makes a joke about people in wheelchairs rather than someone who isn't, and thereby essentially steals the spotlight. So that's a bit of my perspective. At the same time, what's behind it, I believe, is this conviction of freedom of speech. But on both sides, that means humor can encompass everything. However, humor can also be criticized for it. And I think it's important not to fall into a victim role and say, oh, you can't say anything anymore, whereas in fact you can say quite a lot as long as you operate within the Constitution. And then you should be prepared to receive responses. This isn't the same as automatic cancel culture or saying we don't want to work with this type of person, but this is more about action and reaction. And if you present your values publicly, then it's also okay if these values are acknowledged and reacted to. It can be powerful to listen and accept apologies. I think sometimes there might be a fear of making a mistake and then adopting a defensive stance. And I found that it works really well to say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you, and I'm happy to do things differently in the future. And then this whole saga of big words like cancel culture and rejection or whatever doesn't happen at all. Instead, if you show that you reflect, engage, and can listen, I believe you can learn a lot and emerge well from such situations. It doesn't have to be a big drama. Then you can laugh together again, which is really the beautiful and intended goal of comedy. Yes, exactly.
And I really wish this willingness from all sides, that when someone truly apologizes and says, hey, I'll do better and I'm ready to learn, that you also extend a hand and say, well, everyone deserves a second chance and everyone can show they can do better. And then that should be okay. Yes, thank you for this small detour in this direction. It was important to me to talk about it. As you've already said, I myself, as a disabled person, also have a perspective on this and found the topic interesting. I would like to return to the work environment and professional work.
Sure.
Namely, we've already looked a bit at how you can start a conversation. What can you do if something like that comes up in the work context? I'm interested in why it is so important to talk about this topic at all. How do extremist or even racist attitudes affect the work environment and the productivity of a team?
Exactly. I think it's always a crucial question to first consider why this should concern us at all. Why should we talk about it? Fundamentally, it has been learned through experience that when these conflicts arise in a team, it endangers the psychological safety of the team. Psychological safety in a team is a psychological concept that describes how well teams work together, the culture of dealing with mistakes, and how well they come together. I could briefly answer the question by saying it's bad, it's really bad, it's unhealthy for teams. It leads to many negative outcomes. I'll rattle them off now, and much of it makes a lot of sense. Indeed, people who work in such teams suffer when extreme statements are made. They experience lower life satisfaction. This also leads to more mistakes occurring within the team. Communication decreases, it worsens, and people communicate less on an objective level and more on other levels, feeling attacked more easily. We further reinforce compartmentalizing, categorizing everything. And actually, that's what we try to counteract, especially when we at PME Family Service go into companies. We try to foster more joy and positivity, leading to people being more productive, more resilient, and experiencing less stress. And exactly the opposite happens when we have teams where this is an issue, a problem. We have much more stress, a lack of concentration, fewer opportunities to think and reflect, a decline in creativity and innovation, more withdrawal into the home office, social withdrawal. So all of this happens much less, and it often becomes more emotional, meaning we have more anger, more helplessness. And on the factual level, what we can really observe is the increased number of sick days. We have many more sick days, much worse results. So the problems are real, and therefore it's so important to pay attention and ensure that teams can communicate well with each other again. And that's essentially what it is about.
This means it also has very tangible negative impacts on teams and on the productivity and functionality of teams.
Yes.
What psychological mechanisms are actually behind the willingness to express extremist views? One might say that anyone who grew up in Germany is familiar with the political climate and has an idea of what is socially accepted and how far one can go. There are even legal parameters, legal provisions that at certain points, very, very few points, because freedom of speech is of course a very important asset in the constitution, but still there are certain areas where we agree this is not a topic in Germany, that this does not belong to the topic of freedom of speech in Germany. But where do the psychological mechanisms come from that explain the willingness to express extremist views?
I would like to soften the question a bit. It's about extremist statements and views, but we don't need to go that far. I think I would like to address it with the word extreme, because extremist is a step further. Let's first look at extreme statements and views that are shared. I want to include everyone because I think it's becoming easier for us as a society to harp on how terrible it is, especially what the right wing, the far right groups, are doing. I think it's important to state that right-wing extremism has no place in Germany. And what I want to talk about now are these psychological mechanisms which actually affect all sectors of the population and are indeed happening.
I want to interrupt you there for a moment. I would even like to soften it a bit at this point. I would say that all extremist positions, whether on the left or the right, should have no place in a democratic society.
Yes, that's a good assessment. Exactly. And in order to properly look at this, it's important to understand what causes people to go to extremes in the first place. We are noticing this more and more nowadays. It's also the topic that has occupied the media for several years now. This issue of division and the us versus them mentality. That's exactly what lies behind it. It doesn't matter whether you are considered more left or more right. This us versus them mindset develops quickly and easily. The psychological construct is somewhat in-group and out-group. In research, we often prefer using English terms, but essentially it's about the own group and the other group, the group outside. We quickly start thinking in these categories. One reason for this is a need for security or a lack of security, which then leads to fear. This particularly happens during extreme times with a lot of uncertainty. Our lives are now much more uncertain and unclear than they were 10 years ago. We have more uncertainties to contend with. This means people are increasingly looking for other ways to bring security into their lives. There are fascinating studies that show this phenomenon of in-group and out-group. Originally, this was researched in 1950 by social psychologist Sherif, who studied this among adolescents, and it has since been repeatedly confirmed. The effects are real. He sorted adolescents in a youth camp into 2 different groups, and as soon as these groups were formed, and it was about having a certain competitive situation, which is what we see in reality now, money is getting tighter, and we feel resources are becoming scarcer. This means we have this supposed competition for jobs, for money, apartments, specialist appointments, whatever. As soon as there was some competition, these young people immediately started to overestimate their own group, with whom they previously had nothing in common, and began to devalue the other group, even denying them some humanity. That escalated quickly and strongly, a phenomenon that everyone listening can reflect on, whether it happens to them. What happens in these groups is that you perceive the other group, which you are not part of, as very homogeneous. It felt like they were all the same, all stupid, perhaps slow-witted, not as beautiful, not as smart, whatever. There were many generalizations, seeing them as all the same. Meanwhile, one's own group was perceived as very heterogeneous, as a bunch of individuals, each with their strengths and weaknesses. This is a fascinating phenomenon because only with this thinking can we think so negatively about the other group, seeing them as a mass, a soup. It results in dehumanization. They are no longer individuals. If I really think about who I am talking about, what life is behind them, what suffering story, why sticking with the youth, is this young person in this group and why are they participating in this competition, then suddenly it becomes really difficult to judge him so harshly. But we do it so easily and simply, and it doesn't matter if you consider yourself to be on the left, right, center, above, or below. This happens very quickly and easily among all of us. And it's helpful to become aware of this and start seeing people as individuals and not just as groups. And when you start to think in this us or them way, it's important to take a look in the mirror.
At this point, I always like to say that when someone makes such general statements about disabled people, I always respond with something like, yeah, disabled people, if you know one, you know them all.
And very similarly, there was another experiment later on where this also occurred, which more people have probably heard of. This is the Stanford prison experiment from 1971. In this experiment, The participants were locked up in a prison and divided into groups of guards and prisoners. Very quickly, the participants assumed their roles, which is quite fascinating at first. But then, there was also the tendency to look down on the other group and to think within one's own group, justifying that behavior and finding reasons why it was okay and why the others were perhaps doing something wrong. Groupthink is really, really strong, and for those interested, we can include the studies behind this in the show notes, so you can read more about it.
We will definitely do that. We try to do that in all episodes, putting the things we talk about into the show notes. The nice thing about podcasts with you is that you are always so well prepared. There are always tons of studies ready, and we just have to copy and paste.
Yes, exactly. It's also important to me when I talk about this that it makes sense. And maybe I brought along a study that I would like to briefly present because it's so exciting and might make it a bit easier to understand us humans better. And my goal is not so much to point out what others are doing wrong, but rather to look at what is influencing me that makes me behave the way I do in such situations. There was and I found this impressive, a very fascinating experiment, Ash's conformity experiment. In this experiment, several people were sitting at a table, and 3/4 of the room were in on it. They were basically hired for the study, they knew what was happening, and were not the people being tested. Only a small part were tested, and were then shown lines, and had to say which line is the same length as the other line. So basically, 3 lines were shown, and you had to say if the line you see in front of you is as long as A or B or C. And they were quite clear, Ollie. So this wasn't a difficult task.
Okay.
And what they did in the experiment was to conduct a few trials initially to establish a climate of trust where everyone just answered correctly. And because it wasn't difficult, it was easily achievable. But then there were trials where the people who were in on it, the actors, started deliberately choosing the wrong answer. Like when it's clear that the line is much shorter, that's wrong. The interesting effect is that about 2/3 of the participants also chose the wrong answer. And that's why it's called the conformity experiment, because people want to belong. It is important to us not to deviate, and we find reasons for that. And the interesting thing is, when you ask the people afterward, they believe they didn't do anything wrong. Instead, they create a reality where that somehow makes sense and is true. And I think that's why it's important to always question ourselves and look outside our bubble a bit, even if it's comfortable in our bubble, and it's nice to be around people who think the same way. But maybe for people who use Instagram, just subscribe to channels that have nothing to do with your values. So your algorithm doesn't just show you things that already reflect your values, and you think that's reality, because that becomes dangerous when we start accepting that as objective reality, even when the line is clearly much shorter than the one that's actually being asked about. So perhaps once more for understanding how we humans function in social situations.
I think it's a nice idea, and I've always intended to change my Instagram feed accordingly. I haven't done it yet because it's just such a comforting thing.
Yes, and that's really exciting. And now, even when we talk about it, we start to laugh a little, and sometimes it might even be a bit of arrogance, thinking, that wouldn't happen to me, and ha ha ha, how silly people are. What's behind it, and I think it's important to understand, is really this need to belong, because it gives us security, because we need it. We are social beings, and I think it's nice to chuckle at that and laugh about it, but then also to recognize it in ourselves and start to do such things consciously and question ourselves, asking where we just want to be part of a group, even if it might actually collide with our true values or where it crosses a boundary. Maybe the values are fundamentally the same, but it's actually a bit too much. That could be a helpful perspective.
Absolutely, and it's very clear the need to belong to a group is a desire that lies deep within all of us. Because in the past, being cast out of the group meant certain death.
Fortunately, nowadays there are also quite a lot of other groups that you can join.
Exactly. And then you can choose which group you would like to join. Towards the end, I would like to come back to the question of how we can manage to work well and effectively in a team when there are differing opinions. Yes, without disrupting professional work. Is that even possible? And if so, how?
Yes, so today we've already talked a lot about the idea of you're okay, I'm okay. I think this is the fundamental attitude that's necessary for things to work well, so that we move away from maybe the arrogance of thinking there's an objective right or wrong, and we say we're in a work setting where that might not be so important. As a colleague, you're competent and capable, and I can acknowledge that. It's easier for me when I fundamentally consider you to be okay. And then to define a goal for oneself. At what level do I want to interact with my colleague? Is it important that we exchange ideas? We had that question earlier. And if so, I have a little secret formula called curiosity. When you're curious, you can really listen. When you're curious, you can truly connect. When you're curious, you can listen and set aside your prejudices. You have all your drawers open, and it's possible for us to come into contact with each other. And at that level, honest and genuine communication can occur, where you're free from all prejudices, from everything happening around us in the media, and you simply say, you and I, let's talk. And I'm curious, how did you actually come to that? This can only happen if I first have the thought, hey, you're okay, which is why I can listen to you. That would be the ideal, the perfect way where we say, okay, we want to establish communication, we want to achieve this. In other situations, it might be an unrealistic goal. Perhaps it's not about reaching a consensus, but more about seeing how can I establish my boundaries, show my attitude, and maintain my opinion. And then maybe we won't talk about it again. I can really recommend it. We have a great interview with a colleague, Anne Otto, which you can find in our intranet. You can also Google PME Familienservice interview Anne Otto, or you can find it in the show notes. Very, very valuable. An absolutely wonderful colleague who gave an interview exactly on this topic, and it's very interesting to read.
Thank you very much for the tip. We'll definitely include that in the show notes. To conclude, I'd like to give the listeners something concrete and practical. You consciously mentioned earlier the term extremism and softened it to extreme positions. We talked about the political fringes, what we would socially consider extreme. Now I'd like to focus on what employees and supervisors can do. How can they specifically react when they notice truly extremist, racist, dehumanizing, or discriminatory statements?
Yes, here too. I think it's important to clearly differentiate and realize that there are people and topics where it's not about discussing them further, where you won't find common ground, and where a boundary has been reached. At this point, as a psychologist, I can give advice on handling such situations better, on working on oneself to deal well with such a situation. But there are also legal boundaries, and it's important to take different steps from there. Every company has contact points for this. They have different names. I can list the typical ones so you've heard of them and have an idea. Simultaneously, if there's any issue and you don't know exactly where to turn, and you're perhaps lucky to work at a company that cooperates with us, then the PME Family Service can be the first point of contact to support, to get things sorted and see what the right next steps might be. However, if that's not an option, or if you want to directly seek support within your own company, there is, for instance, the Personnel Council or the Works Council. Every larger company must have an Equal Treatment Act complaint office. That stands for the General Equal Treatment Act, and there must be a complaint office for it. Sometimes, if you feel secure, it could be the Human Resources Department, the Equality Officer, or the representative for disabled employees. In some cases, it might be something like the diversity team or the diversity contact person or whatever else the person might be called. And in the first step, it can always be your own manager. I'm intentionally saying later. Sometimes there may be a conflict or it feels too close, in which case it might not be the right choice. But otherwise, there are other support services available. And maybe, because you asked for concrete things, here are some specific phrases that might be helpful. These are pre-formulated and may not always suit everyone, but they serve as a framework to hold on to. Even if the statements aren't entirely at the legal boundary, you might say, hey, it's important for me to set boundaries here. For example, you could say, I would prefer to get back to work topics, as I feel uncomfortable with this type of comment. This doesn't say, you are wrong or the problem, but rather remain centered on oneself. This type of comment doesn't feel good to you, and you don't want it in a work context, so you're setting a boundary. Or, if it's not so extreme, you might say, I think we have different opinions here, so let's get back to a professional topic or reference. Or, this is an inappropriate topic for the workplace. Let's stay professional and continue. These are concrete sentences to have in mind for addressing things directly. We're moving to a professional level. The other level isn't right, doesn't feel good, and maybe you want to move away from that. And it's completely legitimate to set boundaries from that in a work context.
Thank you very much. I believe this is helpful for many to have something really concrete. Because earlier, we also talked about this powerlessness and helplessness. And if you have 1, 2, or 3 sentences ready in your repertoire that you can actually use in the moment, maybe that's helpful in some situations. And of course, we hope that this doesn't happen often and that many people don't feel exposed to this situation. And that in many places, it's possible to just engage in conversation, to be curious, to be open, and to reach a good outcome together. That would be our personal wish. I would also like to mention that sometimes this AGG complaint office is also covered by the PME Family Service. This means that Sometimes you don't contact your own company, but a service provider like us can also handle this complaint office and deal with these issues. Dear Derya, it was a very interesting conversation on a very, very important topic, in my opinion. And with that, it was a kickoff, or one of the kickoff events for the PME Family Services Attitude Campaign. We hope you enjoyed it, found it interesting, and could take away a suggestion or two. We always welcome feedback at podcast@familienservice.de. Thank you, dear Derya. And as is tradition here, the last words always belong to the guests.
I wasn't prepared for that at all. Now I have to say meaningful grand words at the end too. Thank you, Ollie, for this, for the podcast, for the opportunity to talk about such an important topic. And I hope for some of you, there was something exciting. Thank you, and take care of yourselves.